So my name is Katie Tupling. I'm part of the group that put together this series of webinars looking at power in the Church of England through the lens of different aspects and different lenses. And very pleased to be part of this. I think I might have kicked it off with one on disability, but it was so long ago that I've forgotten and I've slept since then. But we've had some cracking speakers around different areas of different parts of life and the Church of England and how the two come together and where the power might be in that relationship. I'm really very pleased that we have with us two very good speakers this evening, and I'll introduce them in just a moment. But a little bit more about the series as a whole so that you can see where this one fits in that broader picture. The Power in the Church of England webinar series has been organised by the Michael Ramsey Centre for Anglican Studies at Durham University and the Department of Politics, Philosophy and Religion at Lancaster University. And the purpose of these webinars is to explore the many forms of power that shape the life of the church, the ways in which these forms of power shape people's experience in and around the church, the various accounts of power, theological and social, for example, that circulate in and around the church, what it means for power to be exercised in healthy ways, and finally, the nature and impact of the misuse and abuse of power. And so this evening's is looking at that through the lens of neurodivergence and that broad spectrum of what that means. So I'm going to go to Claire first and introduce Claire to you and then hand over to Claire. Claire is an associate lecturer at Regent's Theological College in Malvern in Worcester. Claire is also a PhD student at Durham University, where she is researching the faith lives of women in the New Frontiers group of churches. Claire writes and publishes in the fields of practical theology, disability and neurodiverse theology, and feminist theology. In 2018, Claire was diagnosed with autism. And following this, Claire has written a book for SCM Press entitled Peculiar Discipleship, an Autistic Liberation Theology, which is due to be released in the spring. Claire, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie. I'm just going to share my screen and give you the chance to look at my slides. I do hope that works well. If someone could wave at me to say that it's working, that would be great. Okay, well, thank you everyone for having me. I'm really delighted to be here. Allow me, if I may, to do the important work of situating myself in order to demonstrate both my lived experience, but also the particular way in which that experience informs my engagement with this field. As is going to become apparent, I am writing as something of an outsider to the Anglican communion. So what I will do today, I hope, is make suggestions to you for theological responses to neurodiversity that I hope will inform the work and ministry of the Church of England as you endeavour to welcome people. So, as we've already said, I am Claire. I am a lecturer at Regent's Theological College and a part-time PhD student with Durham. I'm a member of the congregations that I'm studying at New Frontiers, but I have also been a communicant of Anglican churches in the past. I read for my first degree at Oxford University and I lived at Wycliffe Hall during that time. I'm writing this book on a peculiar discipleship, and that's going to be published soon. So this presentation focused particularly upon autism as part of my own lived experience. This particularity should be named now so that it's clear that I speak broadly about neurodiversity and specifically about autism. We shall hear later from others who speak from different perspectives. We, Phil and I, are aware that we do not represent all forms of neurodiversity and its iterations in this presentation, and for that we do ask for your forgiveness. But perhaps if I can start with reading a couple of pages from this book to help with this introduction and to begin this case for the need for liberation in autism. On Tuesday afternoon in 2018, in a windowless NHS consulting room, I sat with my husband and a psychologist. I'd answered a lot of questions, fidgeted with my fingers, doubted myself and gone over questionnaires and artificial scenarios. I had looked at the pictures of a fish on a page and failed to make up a story to explain them. I'd not made eye contact. I'd explained that I had no long-term friends other than my husband, and that my childhood and teenage years had been marked by odd behaviours, obsessive anxieties, periods of deep depression and self-harm. I described my failure to play with my own children, setting up strategies for their entertainment that didn't require my own imagination. I explained that I had a script that I worked from when I met new people, and that if I was planning a social activity, I would play out many different conversations in my head in order to be prepared. I explained a life lived out of sync with the rest of the world, at a peculiar angle, oddly. I noted to the psychologist that I could not bear loud noises, shoes that fit correctly, they need to be too big, lots of different food or to be touched. I told the psychologist that this life seemed to be unbearable, but that motherhood had been a wonderful blessing because it had given me a world that I could enter and live according to my own choices. As I faced the time when the children wouldn't need me as much, I explained, I was at a loss as to what I should do. I recounted a number of failed attempts at employment, at being overqualified but underskilled, that I could never imagine what is good and suitable for me, and by failing to do so had made poor choices. By that time, I had said everything I could think of to say, and I'd run out of words, and I fell silent. At this point, the psychologist reached into her drawer and drew out a pen. She took a piece of A4 paper and signed her name 2/3 down. She explained to me that I was indeed autistic, that my suspicions had been correct, and this piece of paper was my diagnosis. She had explained that going to the GP with my guesswork based on Googling had been the right thing to do. Not only was I autistic, but I wasn't the most mild version either. I was 1 up on the severity rating according to the medical scales. I would need specialist help if I ever had mental health problems again. I would face needing to explain myself to medical professionals. My future employment was uncertain, and my life expectancy significantly shorter than average. I came away from that appointment exhausted and embarrassed. I had wanted an explanation, a justification. I had not wanted to be too odd, even for an autism diagnosis, which is a very real fear that I had. Now I had it, I wished I hadn't. I looked at the students that entered the special school next door to my church and tried to understand how they and I had the same condition. How they seemed quite different to me, neither better nor worse, but different, but yet they shared with me a common thread of otherness that placed us all on the outside looking in, discordant to the rest of the world. But what I did not explain to the psychologist, and what took a number of months and years to begin to understand, was my relationship with my faith that had formed me and sustained me over the years. I have a diverse Christian background, having been all the way up the candle and back down again, born of non-conformist stock, but educated in the heart of the Anglican communion at Wycliffe Hall. As an adult now, I'm part of a third wave charismatic church and stayed in that community for many years. So I found myself beginning to consider how the functions and ways of being formed in such a Christian community of worship might fundamentally be at odds with the way that I lived. For a long time, I had made myself attend home groups, despite finding them very difficult, and I had joined in with the worship practices of the charismatic church, despite finding them loud and unpredictable. However, I had stayed for the sense of belonging, the conviction that God had called people to worship together and to be in community with one another. As I began to consider the implications of an autistic way of being a Christian, I sought out answers to some of these difficulties. I used my journal access from my MA studies to read research papers that suggested autistic people couldn't be a Christian because they were incapable of knowing God. I looked around for other Christians who were saying that they were also autistic, and at that time failed to find anyone. I felt quite alone, but not completely alone. Despite the research papers that suggested other ways, I had always felt a very real and strong sense of the presence of God, of the salvation of Jesus Christ and the life of the Spirit within me. I'd never truly felt alone through all the difficulties of growing up as an undiagnosed autistic adult. I'd unwittingly begun a journey of theological reflection that would take my own experiences of an autistic life and bring it to bear upon the life of the church. As grand as this sounds, this isn't a completed task, of course, but rather a journey that for me began at the moment the psychologist discharged me from her service. I re-entered the world at that moment fundamentally the same person, but irrevocably changed. My world was formed in the Christian faith, steeped in the creeds, the liturgies of the Anglican Church, and the new liturgies of the charismatic nonconformists. I could not separate this autistic diagnosis from the faith that was part of me. That promised me that despite the prognosis of an autism diagnosis, that I was chronically unlikable and unrelatable, that there was a God who did like me and did want to draw me into his presence. What followed was a dialogue with that certainty and the new language I had to describe my being in the world. So I've been invited to speak to you today on neurodiversity, and I think it's useful to clarify some terms at the beginning so as to be clear. Neurodiversity was prominently introduced to wider audiences by Judy Singer. She suggested that it was a category to describe intersectionality and therefore, of course, issues concerning discrimination for people who have been given medical diagnoses of neurodevelopment disorders. The notion of neurodiversity troubles this idea of this medical model that sees people with neurological differences as disordered or ill. Rather, it situates such individuals, including myself, as having differences that correspond more to minorities, and amidst a notion that there is a normal way of being that prejudice against people who do not associate with that normative category. Thus, the neurodiversity model suggests that negative terminology of disorder, condition, suffering from, prejudices and others, those individuals who are in fact part of the diversity of the human condition. Now, I think the quote on the slide is quite a good summary. The concept of neurodiversity can serve to challenge cognitive normalcy and to offer alternative, positive interpretations of autism and autistic identity. Neurodiversity discourse enables a challenge to dominant understandings of autism as a neurological deficit, instead focusing on autism as a neurological difference. I've listed a few possible names here that might situate themselves as being part of neurodiversity, whilst allowing that other box is doing a lot of heavy lifting and is woefully inadequate. Perhaps at the end in the questions, we can suggest ways to overcome that. And the interesting and specifically relevant to the power idea is the alternative idea that corresponds to neurodiversity, which is that of neuronormativity. And for this, I borrow from Damien Milton. This is the primary idea that there is a proper or correct way of thinking and encountering the world cognitively. Such assumptions about normative cognition causes disadvantage and prejudice in the world around us and in the church. It is the case that neurodiversity exists as a minority group and experiences powerlessness both within and without the church as a result. So I approach my understanding of autism from the social model of disability broadly. It is my thesis that deviant and deficit models of autism have contributed to the subjugation of autistic individuals, and theology, I believe, has the resources and motivation to aid in its liberation. It is also my contention that an autistic life is a challenging life because of many intersections, be they intellectual disability, social isolation, or the plethora of additional disadvantages attendant to existing in neurotypical society. And I think it is reductive to suggest that liberation equals, without qualification, simply acceptance of difference. Liberation cannot only be recognition that neurodiversity exists. That is insufficient, I think, to the reality of the challenges faced by autistic people. Recognition alone does not make use of the ways in which theology can speak to the lived experiences of difficulty and challenge that make up daily lives of autistic people. And I suppose I can suggest some of the manners of disadvantage I believe are the tragedy that autism is described as, notions of neurotypicality as the ideal ethical type, pertinent in a faith environment, I think, and attendant to all those disadvantages, the stigma associated with autism. And so churches, I think, being my own and this group's interest, are prone to being sites of autistic othering. They are, in every Christian tradition, places where implicit behaviour is assumed but not explained. In the same way, theology has been made inaccessible for autistic people, partly because it tries to explain it, making use of biblical analogies and metaphors, but also because of the way in which it's structured, expecting logical academic thinking and prioritising it. So I'd like to suggest solidarity as a resource for us. The picture on here is of the Polish solidarity movement, which the Polish church was quite associated with. I believe that liberation theology in particular is a powerful resource to those in a situation of powerlessness. I think that it might function as a source of hope for neurodiversity and relevant to the conversation about power. Many, I suspect, in this audience will be familiar with the origins of liberation theologies in the situations of oppression and poverty in Latin America. As a response to these situations, the liberation theologians sought to resource both through action and theological description the communities that were at the heart of this impoverished situation. By describing God as having a fundamental orientation and preference to the poor, Gustavo Gutierrez and others made significant contribution to theological thought concerning oppression. And I think a neurodiverse, or say an autistic liberation theology, has specific features. These are particular to the liberation that it seeks. These are the raising awareness of the situation of autistic and other neurodiverse people, the championing of liberative acts by neurodivergent people for their own liberation, the joining in of these acts by the church that confesses Christ as a saviour for all who seek him, including neurodiverse people, drawing upon the traditions of the church to inform these acts and reflecting upon them in a way that is uniquely neurodivergent. As such, I'm going to make some suggestions for the work of the church to address the issue of power in relationship to neurodiversity, and it's primarily going to be around this idea of solidarity. If I had more time available, there is much I could say in association with the power idea. I would like to have made the case for neurodiverse oppression in relationship with political productivities. It is enough to say that neurodivergence makes for difficult relationships with liberal economic productivity and disenfranchises individuals from the typical routes of economic security and therefore to power. It is also enough to say that typical ways of knowing and sharing knowledge, be that God knowledge that the church is so interested in, or more broad knowledge, is subject to negative evaluative stances. Speaking of autistic knowing in particular, the need for linear, logical, verbal, and academically vigorous knowing limits those who do not engage with the world around them in this way. This is perhaps epistemic injustice. For neurodiverse people, there is powerlessness. This I hope I have hinted at, if not demonstrated. I would like to suggest that the church can help in this powerless situation by way of demonstrating solidarity. And I think perhaps solidarity is something of a common parlance, coming to mean something between sympathy and empathy. However, I would like to suggest it is more fundamentally to do with theological anthropology. That humans are made in the image of God and this Imago Dei suggests certain behaviours and stances are required. To cast neurodiversity in the light of Imago Dei is explosive potentially. Rather than understand neurodivergence as lacks or impediments, tragedies or disasters, but understand them as part of glorious creation. The exercise of power in solidarity with autistic and neurodivergent people must be carefully navigated. The risk being that power imbalances remain and what begins as a quest for solidarity descends into something like paternalism. So this image has on it an icon. It's the orthodox icon of creation, where the human is shown to be made in the image of God, and the first thing that the human sees is the divine face itself. I'd like to make the case that there is no requirement for sameness for a fully outworked belief in solidarity. And this speaks to the differences and polarities that are sometimes found in autistic dialogues. The commitment to being an ally does not require the experience of the same situations in the same way. It is the case that no two autistic people are the same. So therefore, even autistic people amongst themselves have to enact solidarity with one another. For example, intersections of race, gender, and sexuality significantly alter the experience of autism in the world. Rather, we should choose solidarity as a commitment to love. I would argue that solidarity doesn't require us to experience the world in the same way, but rather to commit to this love in the action of allyship. By identifying in the other who appears different to you, be that as a neurotypical person who regards a neurodiverse person as strange, or as a neurodiverse person who does not feel they understand the neurotypical person, following again Damien Milton and his double empathy thesis. By identifying this other as an icon of God before you, by seeing in their face the face of the divine made holy, by being in the image of God, we are allowed to recognize similarity and difference and embrace it. In this, I follow Daniela C. Augustine. Autistic people, even their very name is distressing, I think. From the Greek autos, meaning self, it implies this inward focus, and they are considered to lack full humanity. The ability to behave in neurotypically recognizable relational ways that identify us as fully human, according to the world in the past. This is both prejudicial in its assumptions and theologically incorrect. Autistic people and neurodiverse people are made fully in the divine image and therefore should be fully incorporated and known as created beings who are complete and without lack, other than the lack that all humans suffer from, that of sin. Solidarity requires us to firmly see God in the other and recognize his good created work. The openness to presence of autistic people in the church is missing, I would suggest. There are very few public church figures who are autistic or are opening up about being autistic. The routes into church leadership require demonstrations of social skills that are not always fitting for autistic people. So I suggest that we need to exercise solidarity and conversion. Conversion, framed by Gutierrez, is a break from the personal and social forms of sin, not just an interior response. Autistic solidarity is active, not passive, active, not emotional. It's more than just an intention to goodwill, but a movement, a change, and an about turn based on the conversion of life necessary for a Christian. Gutierrez identified this active stance as in line with Christ's identification with the poor. As all Christians follow Christ, we follow him to such an identification. It is my contention that the poor and the maligns in society today include autistic people, not only because their chances of employment are so poor that they're likely to be hard up, but because they are poor of the connections and love of the church and society necessary for their flourishing. They are both the poor of Luke and Matthew's Gospels, the poor and the poor in spirit. Gutierrez's instruction to attend to the poor applies to attending to autistic people and drawing them out of the world's imposed silence. And in this way, solidarity means, according to Gutierrez, that they don't have to do the work. Autistic people aren't required to change. But we should be loving all autistic people as everyone in their own social context. My interpretation of this for autistic people is the form of a radical hospitality that does not require them to do the majority of the social work of changing. Autistic people who are fully part of the community and who all Christians stand in solidarity with should not be required to change who they are. The onus is not on the autistic person to socially behave differently, but the church to accept them as they are in solidarity with them. It is not solidarity if they have to reject themselves in order to be welcome. This aspect of solidarity is therefore radical hospitality, and it's with this description that I end my planned words. Thank you.
So moving across to Phil Groves. Phil is a parish priest and has been ordained for over 30 years. So folks who are itching for the specific Church of England stuff, this might be where you want to listen in a bit more carefully. He is the canon of the Diocese of, oh, Phil, unmute and tell me what it's called again.
Papua. Papua.
Mpwapwa in Tanzania, thank you, where he taught theology. In addition to parish ministry, Phil was on the staff of the Anglican Communion Office, where he was the facilitator for the listening process on human sexuality, and directed a project of mutual listening for reconciliation called Continuing Indaba. Phil's dyslexic gifts have assisted him in connecting, communicating, imagining, and exploring. He has a missiology PhD on partnership in mission. He co-authored and edited The Anglican Communion and Homosexuality with Dylan Parry-Jones, co-authored, and with Dylan Parry-Jones co-authored Living Reconciliation. He is reduced to tears by this year's John Lewis Christmas ad because he is a foster carer and knows exactly what the skateboard man is going through and what will happen afterwards. And finally, Phil has appeared in a major film, but he says, don't ask him which one it was. The chat box is open. Phil, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you very much.
It's interesting, a place that Claire left me with, which was that idea of that she objects to the idea of we're only available with a super skill. We're going to come on to something I think is at the core of dyslexia, but I'm going to open up with saying that I'm dyslexic. I say it loudly, I say it clearly, and I say it with pride. And I love that community of people. All my best friends for a very long time have been dyslexic. My wife is not, and she has to live in a family of dyslexics in that our 3 children are, and my mother is as well. If you have never seen the Made by Dyslexia website, then I'm working out how to share my screen. Oh, why isn't this sharing my screen? Oh, there we go. It's because it's down here. This is also using somebody else's system. Is that shared now? If you yeah, there we go. There we go. Made by Dyslexia is a fantastic website. This is what I say. We believe in the game-changing power of dyslexic thinking. Everything from the light bulb to the iPhone, the aeroplane to the motor car was invented by a dyslexic mind. Our skills are vital in shaping the future. What is it to be dyslexic? Exploring, curious and constantly challenging received wisdom. 84%, Claire and I were discussing how they did their research. We're not entirely sure, but they're confident. 84% of dyslexics above average at exploring. Imagining, creative and original. Again, 84% they claim of dyslexics are above average at imagining. Communicating, crafting and conveying clear messages. 71% of dyslexics above average at communicating. Reasoning, understanding patterns, evaluating possibilities. 84% of dyslexics above average at reasoning. Visualizing, interacting with space, senses, physical ideas and new concepts. These 75% of dyslexics above average at visualizing. Connecting, understanding, self-empathizing and influencing. 80% of dyslexics above average at connecting. Now, I think these are kind of key themes that that I think that dyslexic people, that strategic teams would want. And I think that those kind of things should be of great value to something like the Church of England. People with those kind of abilities be important in strategic planning. You probably know, I'm sensing that we have a lot of people who would regard themselves as neurodiverse within this team, and you probably will have noticed that MI5 is actively recruiting both autistic and dyslexic people. They're doing so specifically to broaden the skill sets of their teams. Well, what about the Church of England? I don't think I don't think that it is hard to find a theological imperative within diversity, the concept of the body of Christ in 1 Corinthians 12. And we don't need to think about that need for diversity as a functioning body. It's not a woke liberalism, but an essential element of a functioning community, especially the community of believers. So my experience is that the church is way behind MI5 when it comes to paying attention to 1 Corinthians 12 in the context of neurodiversity. And I think that that should cause some alarm bells to go off in our church. I became particularly aware of this problem in 2021. A group called Mosaic was launched as a movement supporting Anglicans for an inclusive church. And I read their documentation, and unusually they'd included neurodiverse people among those facing discrimination in the church and the world. So I kind of was, yeah, well, that's new. Normally inclusive church and so on haven't really included us. But Mosaic sought patrons, and that was one of the ways that they did things. They also shared resources. Patrons were people in senior non-episcopal positions in the church, archdeacons, deans, those who would self-identity within the categories of within one category or more than one category. Could be a disabled gay person, for example. Resources were links to books or websites. When I engaged with the leadership, they told me they couldn't find any person in senior leadership in the Church of England who would self-identify either as autistic or dyslexic. And I talked with the members. That doesn't mean to say there aren't any. It's just that they wouldn't self-identify as that. I talked with members of the steering group. They looked. They couldn't find any. They didn't have any resources. We have the Bishop of London. She has declared herself dyslexic, and I find her case particularly interesting. I spoke to her at the Lambeth Conference this year. She has a very significant role prior to ordination and full-time ministry, and for very excellent reasons had an unusual track through to being a bishop. And I think her story actually may highlight the issues for dyslexic clergy trying to pass through the system in a more normal way. We are a very hidden minority for many reasons. So it's possible that there are more dyslexic bishops and leaders, and every reason for them to keep quiet, as we will see. We know, I do know that none of the leadership of my diocese, the Diocese of Oxford, openly speaks about being neurodiverse. But we also know that there are many clergy in LLMs, that's locally licensed lay ministers, or local lay ministers or lay ministers, are dyslexic. A few years ago, the leadership of our archdeaconry became aware of the large number of dyslexic clergy and invited us to gather, and we founded a clergy dyslexia forum. The diocesan aim was to bring us together so they could offer us software, and they could offer us advice on putting coloured screens over our prayer books and use coloured paper and use fonts that would help us, and so advice on making us kind of more normal. Our aims were for mutual support and to address the leadership of the diocese. And we, after a couple of years, we get joined by clergy from other archdeaconries. The person who was commissioned by the diocese to put it together discovered she was dyslexic, which came as a surprise to her. And we started to change the way that we ran as a forum within the diocese. We kind of started to find that people said that they thought that maybe even 20% of the clergy in the diocese are dyslexic. And we have within our group one of those in the Director of Ordnance team, helping with Ordnance through selection through to training. And in one archdeaconry in the Diocese of Oxford this year, 50% of the curate intake are dyslexic. So the diocese is buzzing with dyslexic clergy, and none of us are part of the senior leadership. We're women and men, completely different church traditions, different ethnicity. Some of us may be physically disabled, gay and lesbian, women and men. But what defines us collectively, more than anything else, is shame. When we launched the forum, a couple of clergy around my age joined us. And then they wrote to me privately, or they phoned me up, and they said they couldn't risk being known to be dyslexic by senior staff in the diocese. They felt that they would be humiliated. A neurotypical theological educator joined us. She was aware that dyslexic ordinands needed support, and she'd supported them through theological education. But when she was actually at our training college, what surprised her was that the support they needed was counselling because of the corrosive effect of shame in their lives. So shame, why is shame such a dominant theme? Well, if dyslexia has these upsides, it also has with it, for those of us who are dyslexic, many kind of, there are many barriers to in our lives. The brain working differently, dyslexia is a problem with sequencing and ordering. That's what I, in conversations with kind of professors of dyslexia and things like that. And I think for me, I mean, our school administrator was talking to me about her. Well, I went and said, I'm arrived early for the assembly because I struggle to keep my day's diary in order. I'm never entirely sure, even if I'm on the right day or the wrong day. And this is about my dyslexia, ordering my day, getting myself with the right things, that I've brought the right things for the story today, all these things. And she said, tell me about it. And so I told her, and she said, you're describing my younger son. He can't seem to manage all this. And I just get so frustrated with him. The untidiness of the dyslexic life, the inability to put things away in the right place, the ordering of the task. We went round and met with her, and she said, you know, I just get cross with him. Why can't he put his shoes in order? And we kind of transformed her life by saying, actually, have you thought that he might be dyslexic? And actually, lo and behold, issues with spelling and all those kind of things. He's a very clever little boy. He kind of hid those, managed to get through that. But this dyslexia thing of ordering, of getting a task ready, we fail at early on in tasks which others find very easy. Of course, dyslexia is discovered in schools through the inability to order letters, otherwise known as spelling. Papua, I can spell very easily. Swahili spelling is entirely phonetic. I can read in Swahili pretty easily and spell in Swahili pretty easily. English is an absolute nightmare. And all through my school life, the spelling test was the time of shame. We are slow at reading, but actually as a dyslexic with a PhD, but reading isn't inevitably a problem for dyslexics. Teaching dyslexics to read is actually about enabling us to fall in love with that reading. Jackie Stewart said it was the braking distances on every racing track in the world, and because he was so driven. Sorry, that's not meant to be a pun. He was so driven to be a racing driver, he could read all those books doing that. That isn't the problem. The problem is that English primary schools use phonics to teach literacy. A child is told to break a word down into sounds. These are sounded out in order, and this is, well, it's sequencing. It's exactly what we're bad at. So it's a nightmare. It makes reading an impossible task. We're told to do something which is challenging, and then we're given a way of doing it which is the most difficult for us, whereas actually learning shapes of words is much easier. What we are being asked to do is being asked to learn as if we're neurotypical. And we're not, we're neurodivergent. And this is a bit like conversion therapy. We're being asked to do something, and we think and we fail, and that failure produces shame. We are failures. We know it all the time. We're told that spelling tests in the way that maths is done, all this kind of way through. And I was told that I was a failure at maths because it was untidy. Those kind of things that go through. So earlier this year, I was really interested. The Tony Blair Foundation published a policy report on education in England, and it said, the education system in England continues to rely heavily on passive forms of learning focused on direct instruction and memorization. Taken together, the current curriculum mode of assessment and inspection regime drives schools to overemphasize knowledge, to instill a narrow set of methods and subjects, and they propose a different direction. Pupils need a good grounding in knowledge, but to flourish, they need space to develop critical thinking, creativity, communication, collaborative problem solving, the 4 C's. Well, an education system that would be wonderful. I don't think it's going to happen, but you never know. The education system alienates us, shamed young people, angry young people. They wreck the system. Dyslexic children are excluded from schools, and a key marker of systemic and structural discrimination is in the justice system. The Centre for Social Justice says that the likelihood is that 10% of the population are dyslexic, up to 50% of the prison population dyslexic. So civil rights activists in the US have researched the school to prison pipeline for African American youth and Hispanic youth. And I suggest such research is needed in the UK for the same reality for dyslexic youth, especially in socially deprived areas, because dyslexia testing is largely parent driven and the preserve of the wealthy. So shame. What happens to the older clergy? They say, I don't want to be known as dyslexic because I will be shamed. If you inform a bishop, an archdeacon, or anyone else in power that you're dyslexic, they will want to help you. They will do so in the nicest ways, but they will induce shame. I wrote to my bishop explaining how I viewed myself as neurodivergent, not disabled, and he replied to my email by putting me in touch with Katie, actually, our diocesan disability advisor, who'd be able to help me. Now, Katie, you are wonderful, but you and I both know that lumping neurodiversity and disability does neither of us any favors. And what we have in common is probably our reaction to the power structures that are there. Another member of staff sent me details how I could access software. And immediately I know that I've got skills to offer, but what I'm hearing is that what they think is going on is that I can't do things. And it plays into my shame, and I just fill up with that, and I feel stupid and walk away. We're asked to think, sometimes people ask us to think outside the box. I suggest that for dyslexic people, we don't really see the box. And that causes us a problem. Because of that, we are not really listened to. When we come up with ideas, the center is preserved, and we're sent into new forms of church, fresh expressions. A lot of the leaders, I became to discover, a lot of the leaders of local kind of fresh expressions were dyslexic. And what it enabled is a creativity, but creativity in a place that meant the center didn't need to change. And actually, promotion to senior positions comes from within the core. Once you've gone into the fresh expressions, you've been moved out into the side with that. So the question is, of course, why do we bother with a church? Well, when I was in the Anglican communion, I met with a community of indigenous Episcopalians in Southern California who were embracing their cultures through songs and stories. And they said something very interesting. When they were asked why they associated with a white-dominated church, a church that inflicted genocide on their people, the church of that robbed them of their language and of their land, they replied, the church may hate us, but Jesus does not. And being Jesus people, they still gathered in that place and they still wanted to reclaim it. A gay member of the group who met with them there spoke up and said, they're not the only people who are hated by the church, but loved by Jesus. And then reaching out to dyslexic Christians, I get that same answer as I've started to be much more open about my dyslexia within a church. Even the very house that I'm living in is a dyslexic member of one of our churches here in the villages where I serve. The church may be a place of shames us, but Jesus is the one who removes our guilt and shame. And neurotypical people, I think, sometimes forget that Jesus won the victory over law. They think about sin and death, but Paul says it's law, sin, and death. And freedom in Christ is liberating, and it is our liberating place. So what could we do for the church? Well, I went to a clergy conference this year. The conference was built around set-piece talks by diocesan bishop and selected speakers, a bit of questions and answers, workshops, even this format here. I worked in kind of African and other indigenous, North American indigenous and Asian ways of conflict resolution. And one of the things I worked with was Bishop Michael Curry and someone called Angela Eiffel, and they had a typical American process, very similar to our clergy conference planned, and we exploded it. We invited the Black Episcopalians conference, and we ran it in a completely different way. No speakers. The wisdom was assumed to be the collective of those who were attending. And the transformative result was enormous, but they needed that vision. Obviously didn't attend the meeting. It was, a white man coming telling Black Episcopalians how to run their meeting was not a great there, but I got Michael Curry, and Michael Curry and I worked on how we would, and he led that, and he changed that. It was an imagining completely different to where a neurotypical team could have done it. And that also enabled me to work with the American Friends, the Episcopal Churches of Sudan and South Sudan, with 150 Sudanese and South Sudanese Americans, people who were, we could talk about that further, but they were the lost boys, lost girls, living and worshipping in TC, in Episcopal churches across America, from a diversity of ethnic groups, at war with each other, their ethnic group at war with each other in South Sudan and Sudan. How could we build and I silenced the speakers. The Americans didn't understand it, but we silenced the speakers. We worked on process, and we resulted in real change and reconciliation within the place where we could have even had violence within the setup it was in Denver and Colorado. The Americans didn't like it very much, but the South Sudanese and Sudanese Americans rejoiced in the way that it has continued to change their life. And that's about transculturality. That's about the ability to explore all kinds of things. The impasse of the Church of England on women bishops, I was asked to play a role in enabling the synod to walk together, and I was able to gather what was said and present it back to the synod in a form that they recognized and reimagined how they would work there. And I did this because I'm dyslexic, and my non-dyslexic colleagues had no idea what to do at that point, and it was about thinking outside that box. I can't see that box. But the Church of England is in rapid decline. How can we manage? We can just manage the decline by thinking the way we've always thought. But diversity means women and men, people of diverse social backgrounds, not just public school and Oxbridge, people from UK minority ethnic groups, but who are part of the global majority, disabled people and other who identify as LGBTQ, all the lists we're liable. I'm going to leave somebody out, but you know those lists. We need that diversity, but we also need neurodiversity, both autistic and ADHD and all those levels of dyslexia. We need a different way of thinking. And in order to do this, we have to address this issue of shame. Those in power and authority need to embark on listening. They need to do this actively, and they need to get out there. And they can only do that by shedding power. And they need help. They need help to recognize that they do not have the ability to design that process or change without that help. Some of you may know of the Pilling Group that worked with LGBT people. I worked with the Pilling Group, which initially was 5 powerful white men. They were all bishops. They added laity to the team, women, one person who was not white, but still that group held power. They invited contributions. They sat in judgment on those who came. And they came to me it was by chance, really, but I ended up speaking to them, and then they asked me to design their process. So I broke up them up. I sent them in pairs, and I sent them into the place where they felt most exposed, least safe, and helped them with LGBTI plus facilitators. The more liberal inclined ones took time to listen to clergy who self-identified as same-sex attracted. They came out of their comfort zones. I sent them into the homes of the LGBTI people and sent them into a place where they lost their power, where the purple shirt meant nothing, and changed that whole perception. That's what we need. We need people to, so this question of what is power, we need to be like Jesus. It's in Philippians chapter 2. The imitation of Christ in shedding power and being alongside those who have been shamed is the only way that those in power will change their first reaction from how can we help you to how can we be enriched together when encountering those who are neurodivergent. I think there are some concrete steps. We need some research on how many clergy and lay leaders are neurodiverse. Every diocese needs to establish support groups for neurodiverse clergy and lay leaders. We need openly neurodiverse person needs to be front and center of encounters with potential ordinands to encourage and empower them. Theological education needs to look at the 4 C's, not just general education, and we need to open it out from the narrow passing of knowledge in a neurotypical manner. There needs to be active recruitment of the diversity of people, those who aren't neurotypical, to strategic planning at diocesan and at national level. And the Church of England must consider the promotion of shame culture through its church schools, and it needs to address the culture of education. I have not looked at how long I've taken to present this, and I've probably gone a bit over my time, but that's I suppose is a beginning point. What I picked up in the questions that came out is I think you've got an awful lot of expertise and knowledge within this group, and so I'm looking forward to seeing some of those questions. Thank you.